Hi, everybody. Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. This is the last talk of David John Angaiak's artist residency speaking engagements with the Sheldon Jackson Museum. This event is sponsored by the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum and the National Endowment for the Arts and private donors, as was his entire residency. We've had him here almost 3 weeks, just a little bit longer. And I'd like to start off with land acknowledgement before we begin for David John's presentation, and I'll introduce him briefly before he starts after that. So welcome to the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum's lecture with David John Angaiak today. We would like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to the Indigenous people of Tlingit who have occupied this land for longer than any of us can imagine. And after 250 years of colonization in Alaska, are graciously allowing us to share this amazing land with them. Thank you. David John Angaiak lives in Wasilla currently, and he's a visual artist whose work expresses his Yupik, Eskimo, and Unungan Aleut heritage. Those are his words. He often depicts nature from personal experiences centered around bird and sea life encountered along the coast of his ancestral homeland of Bristol Bay, Alaska. As a contemporary mask maker, he likes to incorporate both traditional and modern elements. Inspiration for his work comes from a deep desire to keep this art expression alive for future generations to take hold of. He was first introduced to this art form by his father, who is originally from Unungan, a Yupik village along the Bering Sea. Our artist in residence after our upcoming artist is actually from Unungan, so that's a nice connection there. And David John will give his own introduction and begin his presentation now. I'd just like to let you know that we do have an upcoming artist who's at the Baskin. She'll be coming on Wednesday, September 14th, and her name is Selena Alexander. So please join us for her events and for the associated activities in the month ahead. Thank you so much. Welcome, David John.
Well, good afternoon. Those of you that are joining us on Zoom, as well as the folks here live for this presentation. My name is David John Angaiak, and I am a Yupik and Unungan mask maker, dance fan maker, kayak maker, and it's those things that I love to do. So my family line, my mother is from Naknek in Bristol Bay, and you can see down towards the Alaska Peninsula. That little nook in there and body of water is where I grew up commercial fishing with my family. And my father is from Nelson Island, and although it doesn't look like an island on this map, it is indeed an island, and his home community of Unungan is right along the Bering Sea. Like Jackie had said, I currently live in Wasilla, Alaska with my wife, Robin, and our 6 kids. I have 4 girls and 2 boys in that order. And, growing up in Bristol Bay for me has inspired much of the art that I do, playing along the coast and, being on the open tundra, and the adventures that I've had, is is an incredible inspiration for me. So I've called this a snapshot in time, but really, this is just a sliver in time of the history of the Yupik people and the peoples throughout our state. As a little boy, I developed an awareness for my culture through my dad, who had started to make a story mask in a university program when I was about 10 years old. And, that developed this hunger in me to explore the things that I didn't know about my heritage. Because as a little boy, I grew up in the interior of Alaska, far away from my homelands during the wintertime. As I got a little older, I began to look through publications like the book Inua, the Eskimos about the Bering Strait, and Faces, Voices, and Dreams, a publication that was written to celebrate the 100th year anniversary of the Sheldon Jackson Museum. And I was amazed by the artwork of my people. Really, I was watching this artistic expression that seemed to be just a part of their everyday life. We have art today that we look at and we put on a wall, or we have it on a shelf, right? Or maybe it's in big installations and for businesses, but the artifacts and the things that we call artifacts today were art that was lived out in the everyday. So this produced a deep desire for me to create. And, my journey as a Alaska Native artist began. And who knew that the simple act of my dad making a mask in my garage in, Fairbanks, Alaska, for his first time would spark this deep desire for me to continue this art expression. So I will say, though, as I started reading these books, I shouldn't say reading. Reading is probably a bad way for me to describe that. I was really just kind of looking at the pictures because I wasn't a very strong reader when I was a kid. Maybe I need glasses. You guys tell me, I'm not sure. But the words felt like they slowed me down. I'm a very visual person. When I see the things that I create, whether it's in wood or on paper, it's already built in my mind. It's just a matter of finding it as I progress. So I have realized the importance of reading, and learning about the history of these different things. And so with that, it's one of those incredible things that it gives more, how would I say it? Well, it gives it more meaning, whether it's a mask or a spoon or a dart or a kayak, being able to see these things and learn about these things in this way is really fantastic. But it didn't end there. So you can see in this picture here's some early attempts of my artwork as a kid. This is soapstone. It's on a wooden pedestal. And oddly enough, it's a little owl. I seem to have a theme with owls. And, that comes from my mom. When I was a little boy, she loved owls. We had owls hanging all over the house. And there's a little owl here in the museum, if you can find him in the gallery, that is super cute. And there's some similarities between what you see here and what I created. As I was looking through these different artifacts and these different publications, I was drawn by the fact that our artwork was created by the simplest means: wood, bone, feather, and all of these things help to keep our people alive for thousands of years. So we're going to jump forward in time a little bit. The first time that I visited the Sheldon Jackson Museum, I was just 17 years old. And my teacher, Steve Peterson, from Dillingham High School, had brought me and another student to see the artifacts that are here in the museum. And I really, truly couldn't believe what I was seeing because, oh man, it's still emotional for me today because I fell in love with these things that I had seen in these publications. And I got to see them with my own eyes. It's truly a treat. And back then, I will admit that when I saw these things in the books, and even when I saw the articles that are here at the gallery at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, I kind of thought that they were super ancient. I thought that they were like, Egyptian age old, like the pharaohs in the tombs, or maybe the clay, the clay warriors of China. Little did I know that they weren't as old as I thought. And I can imagine that surely I'm not the only person, that had that revelation that, no, these in fact are not as old as they look. Excuse me. Hey, Mom, can I keep it? Hey, this is kind of a joke, guys. It's what you're looking at here in the depiction is some Aleut men, and they have probably gut skin rain jackets on. They've got their bentwood hats, and the little picture, the image that you see there is an artistic drawing of actually a Russian ship, I think outside of Kodiak. This is probably in a newspaper at some time. So explorers, collectors, and missionaries is what I'm going to move into in my discussion. And Russia plays a big part in what that looked like for us in Alaska. And in grade school, in lots of my history classes, I learned that the Russian influence on my people was pretty strong influence and not always a good one. The fur trade, it did benefit us in some ways because we were introduced to materials and things that we didn't have before. Trade beads, I think it's kind of funny that we call them trade beads still today, because it kind of reminds me like, I'll trade my rock for your rock. But that's what it is. But there's other things that were traded at the time: tobacco, weapons, and things like that. So in the Yupik region, Cossacks is a derivative from the word Cossacks. And so a foreign person coming to our land, we would say that person is Cossack. And, during this time, there was a devastating presence that had taken place with the Russians. And that was not just through the fur trade, because the sea otter population in Alaska was almost diminished to zero. But I had read on a plaque here in Sitka just a few weeks ago when I first arrived, how my mother's people, the Unungan, or the Aleuts, as the Russian called us, were brought to these shores for combat. And, it's one of those things where it sounds valiant in one sense, because you think, our people are warriors, they're survivors and they're strong. But I can't help to wonder if our people were really brought here to be fodder, kind of placed on the front line as damage control, so that the Russian people didn't perish. It's kind of sad to me that tourist plaques don't say much more than what paints the picture of the Aleut warrior aiding the efforts of a Russian conquest. But, really, such is history when it's used to portray an enemy. So with the Russians being in our lands and around our peoples, at this time in history, the large open boats of the Unungan were destroyed to keep our people from gathering their forces, in a sense, along the islands of the Aleutian chain, and also from fleeing. This would be the means that many people could get away, maybe by the cover of night. But these boats were destroyed, and they were destroyed with purpose. And it was said one way that I read it like this. It says it was to ensure that our ancestors were completely at the disposal of the Russians. And sadly, all the Nagilaks were destroyed, all these open boats. So Russians used the Aleuts to barter for them also in expeditions further south into what we know of as California. And these same people, they were left there. They didn't get returned home to their homelands like they were promised. And it's really sad. But it was in a time when there was no way for them to cry out for anybody to help them. They were put on a boat and brought to a foreign land so that they could trade with the foreign people, because they would have more favor conducting the work with the Indians of the Californian coast, because they look similar. And it sounds, not great, but at the same time, in 2023, I learned that, these boats existed. I literally thought I just had no idea. I stumbled across an article in a paper this just early last May, this was last summer. And, it was this amazing article about these boats being rebuilt, and after 200 years being launched again. And that's an incredible thing, because the knowledge of these boats were not lost. Here in this image, you can see students, and this is in Sandpoint, July 24th of 2023. I would have been amazed. It would have been amazing to see this and to be a part of this. But these students actually got to row this boat. Literally 200 years had gone by since these boats had found their way back to water, and they're alive again. And, our people can take great pride in that. But Russia was not the only one to bring people to foreign lands. In our U.S. history, the U.S. government displaced the Aleut peoples also to relocation camps along the shores, of the Southeast during World War II. And this is kind of a sore point for our people today. because there are people who are still alive who remember these things, and when you think about history and the military mind, the military did not, they didn't forget about the past things that they had done, and I can't help but to think how devastating it was, for the Aleut, considering that Russians, we were once brought here to the Southeast to war against, the peoples of this area. It's my opinion that the U.S. government, when they learned that our people was brought to Japan during World War II, that, we were seen as hostile, that my mother's people could have been potential enemies to the U.S. during that time. And it was from a place of fear, I think, rather than protection. A hasty removal of our people, and I just want to say on behalf of my mother's people, thank you to the people who are here, who helped our families survive. But I jumped a little ahead in history. Edward Nelson, the author, he was a naturalist. He had written the book, The Eskimos About the Bering Strait. On my slide here, I mistitled that. In my mind, I keep saying the peoples, but he was a naturalist, an officer in the U.S. Army Signal Corps, who would later author the book, The Eskimos About the Bering Strait. And his ethnological study of our people is still, I think, one of the most exhaustive works detailing the life of the everyday Yupik person during his day. Yet, I also can't help but to wonder, as a government officer and later an agent working on behalf of the Smithsonian Institute, if his station wasn't one also of reconnaissance. And you hear me talking about these things about the government, but, looking at history from an historical outlook of what government policy had been for the savage, at least from a United States perspective, at a time when just prior to that, hundreds of thousands of American natives in the lower 48 lost their lives and the rest were subjugated, literally liberating them to lands that were uninhabitable. Today, the west coast of Alaska is still one of the poorest places economically in our state. And it's kind of a strange statement for me to make when I say that, because for my people, I don't see our land as being poor because it's so rich in food. It's so rich in the things that we've used for thousands of years to survive. But it's an idea that's coming from a modern age. I will say, I know that I gave a negative connotation here to Mr. Nelson, and I mean no harm, because his book has literally been like a Bible for me. I'm pretty sure, that without his book, there are many aspects of my people's culture that might have been missed or could have been lost. And we're still here and alive today. And there are still many people who remember the ways that we have. But for me, as a young Yupik boy who was growing up far, far away from my homelands, unable to speak to my relatives, because we didn't have cell phones, there wasn't an easy way to talk. This opened up a whole world of wonder and joy that was incredible to me. Oh, an Eskimo and his cowboy. This is from my dad. My dad's generation, they always wanted to be cowboys. He told me that, yeah, okay, whenever they did play cowboys and Indians, they were the Indians. But I grew up listening to him, wanting to watch, A Fistful of Dollars. We got Clint Eastwood on the screen here. He would read, and he still reads Lewis L'Amour books, Tales of the Cowboy on the Trail. My dad would say, DJ, I'm going to go on the trail again. And I knew he was going to pick up a Louis L'Amour, and in his imagination, run off into the sun. For for me, the Eskimos about the Bering Strait, it was, I was kind of a weird kid, I guess, right? So, but it was one of these things where I started to realize that, my people were alive when Sheldon Jackson was alive, and that they were contemporaries with one another. And I started to realize that, Nelson was also alive around that same time, and he was living among our people. And that was just a really incredible thing to me. It was this place where I realized, I started to recognize that maybe our worlds weren't as far apart as I thought they were. You look, nice shades. Want to trade? I love this picture. I have no idea what this guy's looking at, or if he even knows himself. It's great. But Iluk means cousin in our language. And, trading was taking place, all throughout the West Coast, during Nelson's time and during Sheldon Jackson's time. And, what I think is great is that reading these books, like Faces, Voices, and Dreams, it's evident that the trading and the collecting of different artifacts by both private and institutional entities was in full swing. And, it's nothing new, for the buyer and the seller. It was probably a mutual benefit. Some of the publications, that I've read about the times of these trading, the times that there were traders in the area, and there were people that were looking for, these different curios. It mentions that the Eskimo was a shrewd trader. I read something similar to that on one of the plaques here in Sitka just a few days ago. The Tlingit is a shrewd trader. And I kind of giggle inside because, think about it. You go to you go to a garage sale and you might try to bargain with the person, right? It's like a $2 broom, but maybe I can get it for $1. People are people. And during this time there were stories of grave robbers, and there was all sorts of people trying to collect things, that we considered every day. This also marks a time in our history as people where, when I look at the artifacts here at the museum and some of the publications and the images, I realize that designs began to change in some ways. A lot of the designs that you see on the artifacts of our people are family designs, or they have a spiritual component to them. And we start to see tradable things that aren't necessarily unique to our people. I think of the highly ornamental cribbage boards. Cribbage is something that was introduced, and yet, our people was able to make these beautiful works. And I also think of designs in basketry. There's images in baskets that are not, native images. They're images that were, from Europe, and somebody wanted to bring this beautiful basket back to their family and say, look, I was able to commission this person to make this design so that we could enjoy it here, and in many ways still today, a lot of that takes place. I've even seen whole websites dedicated to the Native American antiquities, and these artifacts are still being traded today. I do question, though, as beautiful as these things were made, I do question if it's helped the image of our people across the world, both then and now. I'm not quite sure. Sometimes I think maybe it didn't help. There's the image of the Eskimo man on the screen. And when I was in Texas, a friend of mine that I just met, actually, he looked at me and he said, "You don't look Eskimo." And he meant it, right? But we were in Texas, right? There's lots of Hispanic people, Latin people, and he probably thought that I was Hispanic or Latin, so it's an interesting thing. Oh boy, we're getting to the section of science, engineering, and progression. One of the coolest things about the artifacts from our people's past that still hold true today. A few years back, well, quite a few years back now, I was able to visit an exhibition that was touring the world called The Way We Generally Live. And there's a beautiful book that's written about this exposition, this exhibition. And it showcases our people's ingenuity and the science behind some of the things that we've created. You know, here on the image, we see a snow goggle. And, you know, from a contemporary pop standpoint, you might think of the punks from the 80s. You know, they had those crazy, wacky glasses that they thought were so cool. But from a science perspective of the Yupik people and other Inuit peoples of the Arctic, the snow goggle actually has some science behind it. You can see this image here, it's kind of cupped. And, you know, it's cupped so that on the inside, your eyes are further away from the aperture or the little slit that's made on the front of these sunglasses. And by your eyes being further away from the aperture, it creates kind of a shadow box inside of the glasses when they're worn. And that shadow keeps your eyes dilated so that your mind and the cones and rods in your eyes can take in as much information as possible without the glare damaging your eye. And that's really important if you're hunting. If you're looking out over the water, or you're trying to find animals by land, or you're on the sea ice looking for seals, you know, the littlest of movements in the distance could mean life or could mean death for your people. And, you know, so it's not just something that looks cool that we used to wear, but it was something that was thought through and designed for purpose. That's just absolutely beautiful. You know, the depth of the engineering doesn't stop there. We can see a hunter in his kayak, and he has a little coned hat on. And as a kid, I always thought this was cool because it kind of reminds me of maybe Asian populations where they have those hats that are coned at the top. So I just thought that was cool. The picture next to it, you can see there's one that's much more ornamental in nature, but they weren't worn just as a cover for your head. You know, we wear ball caps today. My grandma, don't go outside if you don't have a ball cap. You got to keep your head covered because you don't want to get heat stroke. I can't tell you how many times I would hear that. Oh, I miss you, Grandma. But this hat actually was also designed with a purpose, and it was an amplifier. When you wore it, the cone shape that it created, if I were looking out and we were in a hunting party on the ocean and we were kind of far away, right? And you were to turn and look to me and start speaking to me, the cone would actually act like an earlobe, and it would capture the sound so that you could hear better from a distance. And again, it's not just so that you and your buddy can talk. Maybe you're alone and you're out looking and you're listening for the splash of a seal or another animal, you know? So it's this amazing thing that when you just look at the picture, or you just look at the artifact without any knowledge, you could misplace or misunderstand or completely miss the functionality and the engineering and the science that went into these things. Okay, I'm showing off a little bit here. I just finished a frame of a badarka. That's the Russian word for kayak, or the ikyaks, the Unungan word for it. But we're just going to sell for the ultimate sea kayak. Sorry, Greenlanders that are out there watching. It's filled with science. And if you look at the bow, I'm sitting on my knees and there's the front end of my boat, and you can see there's a slit that's kind of going back behind the head of a bird. And that slit is going to remain there. When I sew the covering onto this kayak, the upper piece is going to be kind of an upside down triangle that goes back towards the paddler. And the lower piece is going to remain kind of skinny, and it's going to make kind of a diamond shape in its cross section. And the science behind it is that when you're cresting over waves, the lower piece keeps your boat from slipping when you're in a wave, and then the upper piece creates buoyancy. And there's some beautiful examples on Kodiak where they actually have these flares that they create to make that even wider, so that the purpose in that is so that the nose of your kayak doesn't porpoise or dive as you're going over waves. The back of the boat, you can see, I wish I had thought of putting a picture in here of a skinned boat, but the back of the boat, it looks like there's a rudder. The image where I'm holding the kayak up in the air, but that's not a rudder. The skin will create kind of a backwards plow. And the science behind that is when you have a wind-driven current that's behind you, or you have waves that are pushing you, that will actually catch the water and it will assist you in paddling so that you don't have to put out as much energy, which would be important if you're traveling between islands or long distances. And for the youth that are out there, this is absolutely doable in our day. We can make these frames today. If you look at the picture with the ribs, there's the light color and the dark color cross section that's kind of going away from you. Those are spring willows, and they're gathered in the months of May and June. And the spring willow, it's light, it's strong, and you do have to have quite a bit of them, as you can see, to make it happen. But modern kayak makers today that are making skin-on-frame versions of kayaks, they often use white oak, and they have to steam bend the white oak. And I want to say that takes a little bit of work, and the oak is kind of heavy, but with the spring willow, you can bend it in place as it is. So for the youth that are out there, dream big and, and take these things up and build these things. The last image that's on the picture here, this is kind of a cross-cultural mix from both my Yupik and my Unungan side. Yupik kayaks would often have motifs of a smiling face on one side and a frowning face on the other, a man and a woman. And, the importance of that particular member is it keeps the cockpit from wiggling around and gives the cockpit stability, the section where you go to sit into the kayak. And I like to think of it kind of like this. If I'm traveling to spring camp or summer camp and I'm away from my family for days and weeks at a time, and I didn't have a photo or a phone that I could just take out and call my family, also it'd be a way to remember my family. It's just kind of how I think of it. I will say though that sadly, this ingenuity is being lost and it's not being used today. Outboards have taken place of the paddle. It's just simpler, and you can't really use those kinds of hats any longer because the motor is too loud, right? The metal boat that you're in is making noise every time you move around. And the kayak is considered as not a safe way to do the things that we once did. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop making these things. All right, economics of trade. This section, I just wanted to highlight how we, as Native peoples, often see things differently than the rest of the world. I've got a picture here of somebody carving. We've got a business in the center here. We've got a business meeting that's taking place. And then we have, the supply and demand, money and business. I had a conversation with a high school principal back in 2016, and he made a profound statement. He saw me as, he knew that I was an artist, right? And he said, we need art teachers. If he's talking about the Alaska Native youth, could just learn to make art, then they would be in a better situation. That statement kind of rubbed me raw, because I thought to myself, is everyone an artist? I mean, not everyone's a doctor. Not everybody can fly a plane. I think his intent was good. He was caring for the people that he was teaching, and overseeing. But what does it mean to be in a better situation? That's another question I was kind of wrapping around in my head. In the summer times, I grew up in the village. I visited a lot of villages. I've talked to my people. And, kind of made me think that maybe the way he saw it was, for our people, art was the only way of survival. And I don't know about that. So many places that I visited, not just in Alaska, I've seen the curio and the tourist trinket, created by indigenous peoples to, create business, and at the same time, I've also seen that everybody wants something for cheap. It's kind of one of those human things, just throw it in the bag. But I can't help but to wonder, when we have an outlook like that when it comes to art, if it creates a limiting factor for our creativity and the things that we make. And does it diminish the things that were made, like the artifacts that we see, where art is a living function through its entirety? I had another conversation with another well-meaning individual, and we were on a flight back from a village. He's not native, and he said, we, speaking about non-natives, just need to bring a business owner into the village so that they can teach them business principles, and then they'll be able to help themselves. And I thought, okay, I think I understand what you're trying to say. He's a friend of mine, so bear with me on that. I think I understand what he's trying to say. About a year before, I had spoke to a young man in another village, and he works on Hondas, four-wheelers, maybe wheelers. I don't know what you'd call them, but basically four-wheelers. And he told me that he works on his Hondas for exchange for food. And he admitted, I'm not a very good hunter, which is okay. Not everybody's a very good artist. Not everybody's a very good, lots of things. But he knew that he was really good at fixing Hondas. And so that's what he would do. And his relatives would hunt, but he would make sure that his snow-goes and his wheelers would work. And that's a huge thing in a Native community, because not everybody's a mechanic, and so many times I've heard statements like this, and I recognize that the commodity of Western thought, the commodity of Westerners, often don't apply to Native communities or the regions that we live. We have a subsistence lifestyle, and it still is to today in many places our means of survival. Sure, they have money, but what happens when that runs out and you're in the village? You're not on a road system. You're far away from someplace. You can't eat money. That doesn't help you, right? I had another conversation with a North Sloper, another friend of mine, another well-meaning person. He said, I just don't understand why he quit. Now, he's a manager. He goes, I just don't understand why he quit. He said, the guy just said, I need to go home to my family for subsistence. And this is my friend's thoughts. He said he was making good money. I mean, come on. He could have bought himself anything he wanted. And he was making good money. I just don't understand why he quit. And it's another example of the Western mindset, and our people, whether it's art, whether it's food, whether it's travel. We think differently because we live differently. And that's okay. So missionaries. The Reverend Sheldon Jackson was a missionary across the continental U.S., and his eyes turned towards Alaska. He was a Presbyterian missionary with a zeal to reach the heathen with the good news of the gospel. He was also a visionary educator who recognized that the children of Alaska represented a peaceable outcome with the United States government. So future generations were not relegated to a life on reservations. I'm grateful that my people aren't on reservations. And the systematic genocide that the people during his time were experiencing throughout other parts of the then United States of America. So, his efforts and those of his counterparts in his time are still seen today. But his accomplishments and his goals, they weren't won overnight. And he needed to win the mission boards over for him to travel to do the things that he was doing. He needed to win over the U.S. education officials so that he could see these things take place in Alaska for the benefit of the Alaskan people. And his desire, I think, was so that the indigenous peoples here in Alaska could successfully integrate into Western society. His prowess to communicate the needs and receive the financial backing came through years of stubborn pursuit prior to his journey to Alaska. And as a young missionary working his way west to establish churches in the far reaches of the Western frontier, along with his natural talent and curiosity, which really was fostered since childhood, collecting specimens. This talent will enable him to build an appreciable collection of artifacts. During a time when collectors worldwide were on the hunt for genuine articles of primitive curiosities, both private and institutional purposes, his ability to attain these items, many through gifts and later through purchase, ultimately would help him establish the funding needed to secure both a religious and educational foothold here in the far north. His efforts and willingness to learn from his mistakes is a testament to the fortitude and will of a man who I believe generally did desire good for the peoples of Alaska. And, I had read an account of his early years in ministry explaining that he would travel to different places just kind of with the things he had on his back. He would eat the local fare, and he would stay among the local people. And this was not a common thing. It was kind of frowned upon to do that. And yet, when I look at the biblical aspects in the Bible of what missionary work is, that's exactly the model that he was carrying forward, that the early church apostles were doing. It's a testament to his faith, and I'm impressed by his convictions and trust in God to provide for him. And I imagine that lessons learned during this time also helped him, as his heart and mind was later focused here in the north. So recognizing the landscapes of the native populations across North America and how they were rapidly changing as foreign immigrants moved further westward in pursuit of lands, resources, and adventure, he was more determined than ever to establish schools to help the Alaskans adapt for a future which would look far different than they had known possible. Back to the United States government. And I know that I'm talking here quite a bit about this, but the preamble to our Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And I think this statement held true for most English-speaking Americans, of European descent. But, it would not be until 1924 when the Indian Citizens Act was ratified that Native peoples born here on this continent could gain citizenship. And what's even more shocking to me is that years later, although they were citizens, they weren't able to vote or have a voice in governmental matters when it came to, this Western way of thought for 148 years. It wasn't until 1965. It's kind of shocking, and it kind of questions the preamble and who it was really written for. But at the time of Sheldon Jackson, it didn't seem like it was for the savage, and how the American people saw Native Americans. Sheldon Jackson's educational efforts are seen by some people as a means of the end of the native languages. And this is a tough one because the boarding schools, they did not allow native speakers, native language. You had to speak English. And, I'm a direct product of that indoctrination. I will say, though, that I also have an empowered to move beyond that. And I say that because our languages are being revived. Our languages are still being spoken, and there's new means for us to learn our language and be taught. And I'm currently learning how to speak Yup'nun, or the Yupik language. When I was a boy, my dad, who was an academic, multiple degrees, was a federal employee with NOAA as an upper air weatherman. He was a product of boarding schools, and he wanted me to grow up Western. He wanted me to learn English. And he wanted me to be a part of a system because he saw that as being success. He saw it as a way for my sister and I to be able to move into this place called the United States of America, where at one point in time when he was a boy, it was him and his brothers and his family on the land that they've known for thousands of years. And sadly, though, I will say that, his efforts to help us to move forward, I wasn't able to speak with my grandparents on his side of the family because they didn't speak English. I know that they love me and I love them, but that's one of the sad things when you take a people's language and you tell them they can't speak it anymore. So Sheldon Jackson as the collector, like Edward Nelson, who collected the daily and cataloged the daily life of our people, Sheldon Jackson had the foresight to recognize that our traditional way of life was rapidly going to change. I mean, it was happening all over the lower 48. And, in that process, like many across the globe where artifacts are being sought out during that time, he took advantage of that. And he had collected an incredible amount of artifacts, not just for the Yupik people, but also for many people groups throughout our state that we can see here now at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. And my brief hiatus of 31 years, like I said, I was 17 when I first came here. I stepped into the gallery August 18th, and I was blown away because I felt like I was seeing old friends. The things that I had seen when I was 17, I could see here today. And that gives me a lot of hope because these are things that we can't easily see in any other place. It truly is a national treasure that we have. So his efforts and those of his colleagues to establish a museum, along with the many, many people who have helped that process along, making sure that the lights come on, making sure that the heat is there, making sure that guests are invited in to a welcoming place so that they can learn about our peoples, is truly inspiring to me. And I want to say thank you to, Reverend Sheldon Jackson's family and to each of you who in your own way have helped this museum be here today. A heartfelt letter. In an open letter written to Sheldon Jackson by the late Peter Corey, a former curator here of the Sheldon Jackson Museum, he makes the statement. He said, "Why didn't you collect more background information on the artifacts you gathered?" A funny word, artifacts, is come to connote items of antiquity, though it specifically denotes any item manufactured by man. The artifacts in the museum were items of everyday usage when you visited the people in their villages. Now, 90 years later, this statement was written and published in 1988, mind you. But now, 90 years later, they are the material remains of certain aspects of Native culture. Some reflect aspects of culture in a day gone by. Others reflect aspects that continue to the present day. How I wish they could talk to me. People often ask the names of their makers, what various masks represent or mean to the culture, or what is going on in those Eskimo dances, ceremonies depicted in the miniature. That's a beautiful piece, that miniature. I'm adding that. I know you were busy on those trips aboard the Bear, and we do appreciate the information you did record, but there are so much more to be gotten. The notation you collected for the majority of items, indicating locations by village or area and the year collected, have been a great source of information, and the documentation has helped the collection to become one of the most important in the country. When I read this statement in Faces, Voices, and Dreams, I thought, what a brave and heartfelt statement that Mr. Corey spoke from the heart. I so appreciate this opening in this book because it helps me to recognize, not just the things that were gathered, but it also puts a heart and a life into it, because there are other people who desire the best for the things that we have. It's true that many of the articles in the collection here at the museum do have little information, but I want to say again, they're here today. 31 years later, I can still enjoy these things. That's an amazing thing. And I hope that for future curators and naturalists and folks that write about peoples, that you would learn from that, and that the work that you do, recognizing that there's a future people who want to know and want to learn and want to see what life was like today. Yupik masks were often a one-time implement. Many people don't know that. When the mask was done being used during a ceremony, it would be destroyed. It would be discarded. And the collections that we have here today, they empower me. They help me to see something that I would not be able to see in any other way, because so many times these masks that were used in ceremony for prayer and petition, they weren't kept. And so I'm grateful that, they've been kept for the last 145 years, safe for others to see. And just the other day, I apologize for eavesdropping. I'm going to put that out there. But I heard a staff member explaining to a visitor how there was a moment when there was a large group of Yupik people, my family's people, young and old, who had visited the museum. And this wasn't too long ago. And she was sharing how that as she watched them go through the exhibits, she was listening to the elders explain to the younger people what these different artifacts meant to them, and also what these different artifacts meant in general. And that's knowledge that sometimes you can't find in a book, and how beautiful that is, that moment took place. And this is exactly why we need to have these things safeguarded and protected for the future voice of our people. It's why we need to continue funding these programs like the artist residency program here. And it's one of the biggest reasons why I cherish this museum, because these things enable my people to still be inspired and to move forward. Okay, this is going to be a quick one. It belongs in the museum. Man, I was a little kid when I first saw Indiana Jones in real time, not on a VHS, in the movie theater. And a young Indy in the movie Indiana Jones and the Search for the Holy Grail, he says to his friend, "It belongs in a museum." And this is after him and his friends stumble upon some artifact hunters who had found the legendary Coronado's cross. And I will say, I love this statement in the movie, and it spoke to me immediately, because I had been looking at artifacts and publications and seeing these things and recognizing the importance, to keep these things safe. There's a lot of talk about repatriation of artifacts across the American landscape and the world right now. And I'm not going to say what should or shouldn't be here. I think it would be a disservice for my people to make a definitive statement on repatriation, but I also think it would be just a disservice for those who've worked so hard to protect the things that our people hold so dear. Our voices must be heard. I will also say, though, that it's vital that Native Americans are given a voice and are allowed to ask the hard questions. It's also vital that private, state, and national agents consider what is being asked and that they listen. And it's equally important to recognize our own biases, whether you work for an institution or you're a Native American. It's important that we also recognize our own bias and ponder if our awareness of the matters at hand began from a misguided origin. We need to be able to talk. Some questions that have come through my mind: who do these items really belong to? Because items that are being held in federal and state recognized institution, just because they're there, does it make it okay? It's a hard question. And who has the right to these things anyway, and why? And how are these possessions being cared for in a way that is honoring for those who created them, or the people that see them and hold them dear because it's a part of their family lineage? And then also, can these items be cared or protected if they are returned? This is a big one. And which party has the right to make these kinds of decisions and why? I'm going to leave those questions open-ended, and I'm going to allow you as the viewer on Zoom, I'm going to allow the audience that is live here to ponder those things. And don't be afraid of them, because we have to have that dialogue so that not only can these things be protected, but also we can move forward in a way that is honoring to the people that we are around now and currently talking to, but also honoring to our ancestors. Ooh, when is it right? I visited a small private collection in a village not too long ago. It was a wonderful experience to see their people's past. This is here in Alaska, but it began those inner dialogue questions. You know, at the time of my being there, their building that was housing these artifacts, the small museum space that was not state recognized as a private collection. It was under, it wasn't in good repair. The roof was leaking. They were having issues with heating. You know, there was water, there was dampness in the building, mold. And, you know, from what I could gather, this was a daily concern. But what I will say, though, is that they had already at that time recognized a new building to move the artifacts to. It just wasn't, they weren't able to take that step yet. But this impressed on me the importance of protecting our past in a way that ensures it for the future. I'm not opposed by any means to returning artifacts to their home regions. And I believe in some cases it may be vital, especially for the welfare of families, you know, that they're attached to. You know, I think of human remains. It's one of those weird things that are still currently out there across the world in these institutions, much like Sheldon Jackson Museum or some of the other notable museums that have large holdings of Native American artifacts. You know, I think about my immediate family and the ones that have passed on in my lifetime. Would I want to see them in an institution, or would I want to see them return to rest with the rest of my family? Another hard question. And then also, what support is currently available to train up people so that we can create environments to protect these things? Guys, these are relatively new thoughts that I'm having. And, you know, I pose these questions so that hopefully you as the viewer can also have these thoughts moving through your head, because we're coming to an age where we need to have these discussions. You know, is our current system, although it seems to support national and bigger institutions and infrastructure, how can we disseminate this kind of information to these smaller places? Because I'm sure that this isn't the only small collection that is running into a similar situation as the one that I had visited. When is it the right time? I'm not quite sure I have the answer to that. Well, guys, we're rounding up the end of our discussion here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about expectations of the contemporary artist. You know, in layman's term, contemporary just means I'm breathing and I'm still making art. You know, it's a fancy word that we see, you know, but it also touches on what does it mean to be an Alaska Native artist? You know, there's some traditionalists out there that have a pretty strong awareness of the things that they create because they've been taught by masters, and, you know, they're creating things in a way that is trying to honor our past. But it's kind of a tough line between what is contemporary and what is ultra tradish. Here in the gallery, I mean, here in the foyer, I know that you on Zoom can't see it, but I have some basswood that I'm using to create my art. And I've answered a number of questions from tourists and visitors from the community when they say, what is basswood and where does it come from? And I have to say, well, you know, it's not native to Alaska. And I see eyes roll, right? And I mean, it's not. But I also don't live in an area where traditionally masks in my region be made with driftwood. I don't live in an area where I can get driftwood easily. So what do? I use the wood that I have available. And that's exactly what my people did before me. And I share, you know, that basswood is imported. It's definitely imported to Alaska. But if we were to break it down, you know, the very logs that my people go out and seek for their firewood and the things that they made for thousands of years, we didn't have big trees in our area. We had just shrubs. And so these things were a gift. And in kind of a weird way, if you think about it, these trees were also imported because they came from upriver, sometimes as far in as the deep Yukon of Canada, sometimes from the other coast, the Siberian coast. So I don't have quite an answer there, but it's one of those things. What's tradition? What's contemporary? And I want to ask the question, as an artist, for other artists as well, do we have permissions to pull from our present experiences, creating new stories that enable the next generation to live as real human beings? And here's the big one. Or are we destined to live from a place that once was considered modern by our forefathers? And I share it that way because when I look at the gallery and what I see as these ancient artifacts that really aren't they're less than 200 years old. And when they were gathered, they were everyday things for our people. When they were made, they were contemporary. And here I am today, and I'm a contemporary, much like you sitting in the room and those of you listening and viewing online. So it's a little confusing for me as an Indigenous artist at times. The things that I delight in often when I create don't transition well into our Western modern world. I think of the story mask. They're made to be functional. That's their historic purpose. They're made to be used in prayer and petition. And today, they're made to be stories. And they're not functional. Even though I make them functional, the people who purchase these things, they put them on a wall. And I know that they love them and they view them and they take great pride in them. But as an artist who knows its true purpose, it's difficult for me at times as a contemporary artist to realize that those masks that I create that are beautiful are often left static for the rest of their lives. It's the same with bowls and spoons. If it's made into art, it's not used. And I'm not saying that it's bad, I'm just saying that it's difficult and it's kind of confusing. Okay, these are fun. Back to pop culture. Postmodern, postmodernism in native art. The one that looks like a bear, I'll say, a punk rock bear. This was made in 1986 by Lawrence Beck. And as a kid, this is one of the first modern pieces that I'd ever seen. And it drew me immediately because I was already looking at these different masks and things that our people made. And I thought, wow, I want to do that. It's so cool. I mean, it's not even made out of wood. We can't even go the driftwood route with this guy. It is as modern and contemporary as you can get. And I love that because it's art and it's speaking to us. It's conveying a story and it's doing all the things that we desire for it to do. And just recently in 2018, a few years ago, I came across this image on social media, and it's the Northern Warrior helmet by Andy Everson. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I saw it when I was a little kid, in the movie theater. And when I saw this just jumped out to me because I was like, how cool. There's somebody on the Northwest Pacific coast who is making art that, speaks both to our traditional aspect because that hat is very traditional looking. And yet it speaks to our very modern aspect because it's sitting on top of, pop art and the fact that this is a stormtrooper from, a movie series. And, it's one of those things where when I look at this and I see it, it gives me inspiration just as much as the things in my past. And, I want to encourage those that are creating to keep creating because there's young men like I was at one time who saw a mask of a punk rock polar bear, very pop culture at the time, and, here we are today and we're seeing these Star Wars things that, and these new ways of making art that both speak to our heritage and to who we are as contemporary artists. So with that, I want to thank you guys for joining me today on this look at a snapshot in time, really a sliver in our history, and how it's affected me, the questions that I've had and that I'm still asking, and now it's time for you. If there's members in the audience that have a question, I'd love to try to answer that. I have the chat section open for my folks viewing from Zoom. Yeah, if you have a question, I'd love to try to answer if I can. If you have a thought, I'd like to share that with the audience as well. I have one question in the audience here.
Looking at the kayak, and you said it was, the ribs were made from willow, and then the other pieces of wood were kind of a reddish color. What was that one?
So yes, the question for my Zoom audience was looking at the kayak images about midway through our presentation. There is wood that looks very red, and then there was willow wood that looked very light in color. And what is the darker wood? And the darker wood is ash. And so for me, it's imported. I purchased it in Anchorage, and so I used ash wood, and it has that natural color to it. It's very stark and different from the willow, and the willow is very white in color. Yeah. All right. Any other questions from my Zoom audience? We'll give it a few seconds here. If not, and any other questions from my live audience this afternoon? I have another question from the live audience.
I just want to thank you for your presentation, and also comment that it's interesting for me to sit here and hear you ask these different questions aloud, to hear you trying to juggle the fact that you're making these pieces that are meant to be functional, but they're going to be static, and you know that when you sell them.
Right.
And then to also hear you comment about your understanding that even well-meaning individuals like Sheldon Jackson, who are providing, education, but also who are acting as an assimilative force, that activity does have detrimental impacts.
Right.
But it also has some benefit according to what your thinking is
right.
for Indigenous people and for Indigenous people in the future, even leading all the way to your father, who you said was a product of boarding school.
Right.
So I'm sitting here listening to you talk as a contemporary Native artist, and I can't help but think, I'm sure the people of Jackson's day, the people who created the things that are in the gallery here, they were probably thinking the same thing. It probably wasn't lost on them, and here we are 200 some years later, still thinking about, I'm selling this to this white guy, and this is going to go on a wall.
Yeah.
How do I deal with that? Right? Do I encourage him to make more use of it? How do we manage that?
Yeah.
And balance that out? And then here's this person who's trying to, proselytize and suggest that I adapt this new way of life and don't speak my language and don't carry out these activities or dances, etc. But I am learning how to do this X, Y, Z, and I can get a job, with this new knowledge, for example. Well, is it good or bad? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. It's still a struggle, and it's still an issue, and it's entertaining to think about the fact that these questions don't go away, and I'm not sure if for you as an individual and as an artist and an Indigenous person, if the answers to those questions change for you from day to day. Are you in different places on the spectrum when you try to answer these questions? Does your answering these questions get more difficult when you walk into the gallery compared to when you go home when you're carving in Wasilla? How does it play out for you? Is it static for you when you think about it and reflect on it? Or does it change? Does it change when you think about your father? Does it change when you think about your mother, who wasn't a fluent speaker, when you're sitting there studying music? Right. Yeah. So that was a lot for the Zoom folks that are here. I'm gonna have to answer this one just kind of from the heart, and I'll have to, if you couldn't hear the audio on that, please forgive me. I don't think that I can repeat everything, but it really is a question asking about
the dynamics of the two worlds, the traditional world versus the contemporary world, and where do I, as a contemporary artist, which just means again that I'm breathing and I'm making art today, where do I go with that in my head? Like, how does that affect what I create? And are these questions ever answered? You know, I've been asking these questions since I was a kid, and I think I'm going to continue asking these questions. And when I sit down to create artwork and it's from a traditional aspect, and I'm using a non-traditional element, maybe to color the wood of a mask, let's say, as an example, or using ash, instead of birch or some other driftwood that I would find on a beach. There is an internal struggle that I have, because I wonder, am I doing wrong, or am I okay with where I'm at? And, I think back to my grandfather, who had gone from using a kayak to using a skiff. And that gives me peace in many ways, although it sounds strange, because I recognize that he recognized that he was helping his family and that it was a safer means to do the things that needed to be done. And if we, I think, try to ignore the fact that we live in an advancing world because we live among other people and we're affected by many people now more than we ever have been before, I think that we would do ourselves a disservice in that. And we would perhaps miss the beauty of the things that we really can create. And for those that are staunch traditionalists out there, carry that, continue that, because we need to have those voices, and we need to have that perspective, so that we don't lose the very things that made us who we were before. And I think that's one of the sad things about the advancement and modernization of the things that we do. Whether it's a cell phone in our hand, we no longer write letters. How sad is that? It used to be so dear when I would receive a letter from a friend or a loved one. And now I get a text that I forget about, and I can't sometimes go back to it, right? So, I mean, there's lots of examples of both worlds, and it is difficult. And I really don't have answers to many of the questions that I posed today, but I wanted to pose them so that it would give us a frame of thought. I hope that answered your question. I have two statements here online here. I'm just going to read them out loud because I know we're running out of time, but thank you so much for the wonderful talk. You're welcome, by the way. And I enjoyed it very much. When I hear about Native history, I'm always struck by some of the similarities with women's history. Yeah, absolutely. And by this, I mean how women have been misunderstood, have been understood or misunderstood, marginalized, and how they're allowed to contribute to society. Thank you for sharing that, because, there's many other aspects of that too. I mean, it's not just women, it's also Asians, American Asians, it's, the Black community, and it goes much more beyond that. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me, because it opens up that dialogue, so that today we can have conversations across our country about how to love people well and how to be real human beings in a way that brings honor and brings peace to one another. So thank you for your thoughts, Lynn. Another statement here. Maybe this is a question. This is from my wife. I love it. So it says, what is one aspect of all these questions that you hope will have resolution in your children's lifetime? It's gonna make me cry. A solution for repatriation, or the freedom to be seen as a contemporary artist apart from their native heritage, or something else. For my children's lifetime, I think if anything, I don't want them to experience the things that my father experienced. I don't want them to experience the things that my grandfather and my great-grandfather experienced, that were negative aspects of, my son said it this way one day. He said, a Western conquest. So many times in American history, we say it as the Great Western Expansion. But for many peoples of America, Native peoples of America, traditional communities, it wasn't seen as an expansion, it was seen as a conquest. And, I shared a little bit about how, my father wasn't able to vote for, a long time, and that language was lost. And I don't want to see those things happen in my children's lifetime. I do wish to see, that there is a process of healing that can take place so that they can live a life that is meaningful to them and to their family's future. And as far as the repatriation for the solution, I think there's a lot more dialogue that needs to take place. I don't have an answer for that. You heard me say that, it belongs in a museum, and that's a part of my belief system, not as a Yupik man, but just as a modern guy. I think it is important that we protect these things. And yet at the same time, as a Yupik man, right, I also recognize that this is a question that goes beyond just me. It extends out to my family and my people. And then the last part was, or the freedom to be seen as a contemporary artist apart from their native heritage. I struggle with that too. Do I create things that look Yupik? Do I create things that look Aleut? Do I create things that, are not anywhere in that spectrum? And can I do that? It changes from day to day. I can. I think I can. I think I have permission to do that. And, I hope that my children would have the freedom to believe that they have the permission to do that as well. Because, whether it's traditional art, it's contemporary art, it's modern art, it's all the other different avenues of art that's out there. Really, its purpose is as a creative expression of our voice. It brings voice to matters, it brings voice to our community, and it brings voice to our heritage. And for my children and for those of you that are out there, I wish this for you as well. So I don't think I have time for another question. I apologize for that. This particular talk went a little late, and thank you for your time, both online and those that are listening here live. This is the end of my 3-week period as the Alaska Native Artist in Residence for the Sheldon Jackson Museum, and I just want to extend my gratitude and gratefulness for those that have helped me to get here. It's not just signing, documents and getting on a plane. There's lots of people that are a part of this process that not only are doing things actively right now, but have been a part of that process for a long time. And I just want to say thank you. And, with that said, Koyana, and have a wonderful afternoon.